There are places in the world that seem to wait for a man to fall apart. High, empty places where the wind sounds like confession and where the silence feels heavier than any burden he has tried to carry alone. He had climbed that mountain because he didn't know where else to go. There was no crisis, no dramatic collapse, nothing that someone from the outside would point to and say, "This is why he broke." Men rarely have the luxury of an obvious breaking point. They just accumulate weight until the body chooses a place to set it down. He walked for hours without speaking to anyone, without even checking his phone, as if the mountain could save him from the slow erosion he felt inside. His life looked intact from a distance, work stable, relationships functional, health acceptable. But internally, he felt like a house built too close to the edge of a cliff, holding steady only because no one had bothered to look at the foundation. The climb was an escape as much as a last attempt to breathe without pretending. Up there, he imagined he could exist without performing strength, without shaping himself into the man others expected him to be. When he reached the ridge, he noticed something wrong immediately, a dark shape against the snow, too symmetrical to be natural. As he walked toward it, the outline sharpened into the broken body of a private jet. Its fuselage cracked open, wings folded like the remnants of a fallen bird. The metal glowed weakly under the thin mountain light, the way old scars shine when touched. He stopped a few feet away, the cold biting his skin, and felt a strange pull toward the wreckage, as if the mountain had been waiting to show him this. The silence around the jet was unnerving, almost sacred, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that follows a story abruptly cut short. He approached slowly, each step sinking into the snow with a soft crunch that seemed disrespectful, like walking through a stranger's grief. He didn't know what he feared more, finding someone inside or finding no one at all. Either way, he felt the weight of an intrusion, the sense that he was stepping into a moment that didn't belong to him. Yet he kept moving, drawn by a feeling he couldn't explain. When he reached the shattered window near the cockpit, he leaned forward and looked inside. And whatever he saw in that instant didn't hit him like a shock or a wave. It moved through him slowly, like an old truth resurfacing after years buried under obligations, expectations, and the quiet exhaustion men carry because expressing it feels like betrayal of the role assigned to them. He didn't cry because of what the jet contained. He cried because, in that dim cabin, illuminated only by snow-reflected light, he saw the shape of his own life reflected back at him, unfinished, unresolved, suspended in the air between who he was supposed to be and who he actually was. His breath fogged the cracked glass, and for a moment he felt like a child lost in a space too big to understand. He tried to swallow the feeling, the way he had learned to swallow everything that threatened to spill out. But the mountain didn't negotiate. It didn't allow distractions or convenient narratives. It confronted him with the truth that the world down below let him avoid. A man can only ignore himself for so long before some part of him begins to search for wreckage. And standing there, alone with the remains of the jet and the cold that wrapped around him like a question he had avoided for years, he finally let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet release, the kind that belongs to men who have forgotten what it feels like to be honest with themselves. The mountain witnessed it, without judgment. The wreckage held it without asking for anything. And in that stillness, he realized he had stumbled not into a tragedy, but into a mirror. He didn't touch the wreckage. He just stood there, letting the cold seep into his hands until they stung. It was easier to feel the pain in his fingers and the tightness in his chest. Most men learn this trick early. Focus on the body so the mind doesn't have to speak. But the mountain had stripped away his distractions, and the jet had taken whatever was left of his defenses. So he stayed there, breathing unevenly, trying to make sense of the storm rising inside him. What frightened him most wasn't the wreck itself. It was a sudden understanding that he had more in common with his broken frame than with any of the people waiting for him back home. He felt like he'd been living inside a controlled descent for years, functional, stable enough, just not fully alive. The jet made this visible. Its scattered parts reflected a truth he had kept hidden even from himself. His life had become a slow-motion crash no one could see because he had become an expert at holding the pieces in place. Men are often admired for this quiet endurance, the seamless illusion that everything is fine. But illusions come with interest, and eventually reality demands payment. He had spent years performing strength, not the kind that grows from character, but the kind that grows from fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of not being enough, fear of becoming a burden. Every part of him had been shaped by this silent pressure. At work, he was a reliable one. The man who didn't complain, who handled crises without ever showing a crack. In relationships, he played the role of stable ground, even when he felt like sinking sand. He never let anyone see the exhaustion that followed him like a second skin. This wasn't a decision he consciously made. It was a survival instinct, a habitus learned long before he even knew the word for it. Bourdieu would have said he was simply reproducing the patterns etched into him by the world around him. Society had trained him to exist as a steady surface, even if everything underneath trembled, and he obeyed that training without thinking, the way most men do. Because the alternative, admitting he was lost or tired or scared, felt like stepping out of a plane without a parachute. Better to fly the route as expected, even if the instruments were failing and the cabin alarms were screaming internally. Standing before the wreck, he realized how quietly the pressure had accumulated. Unpaid bills of emotion stacked in the back of his mind. He thought of the nights he lay awake, not because something was wrong, but because nothing felt right. He thought of the mornings when he sat in his car before work, waiting for his breath to steady, pretending he was just checking messages. He thought of the people who believed he was a strong one, and how desperately he wished he could live up to their belief without feeling like he was disappearing in the process. The jet held all of this without speaking. Its broken body revealed what his intact one couldn't. When he looked into the cabin, he didn't just see wreckage. He saw the cost of being the man everyone expected him to be. He saw the quiet collapse that happens when a man never learns to ask for help. He saw the silent fatigue of carrying too much for too long. And he understood with a clarity that felt like a wound opening that he had been conditioned not to feel these truths until something forced them out of him. The mountain didn't care about his performance. The jet didn't care about his carefully controlled life. Up there, stripped of noise and screens and responsibilities, he was just a man standing in front of a symbol he couldn't ignore. There was no audience to impress, no role to maintain. The altitude made his breathing shallow, but the honesty of the moment made it deeper than anything he'd felt in years. He realized, maybe for the first time, that his greatest conflict wasn't between who he was and who he wanted to be. It was between who he was and who he had been told he must be. A steady provider, a quiet pillar, a reliable presence, a man without fractures. But every role he had mastered had pushed him further from his own center, until the only quiet he could find was on top of a mountain, staring at the remains of another man's final descent. And that was the truth he didn't know how to speak. He wasn't afraid of breaking. He was afraid that he already had, and no one had noticed, not even him. He stepped closer to the jet, not because he wanted to, but because something in its silence called to him. The snow around the wreckage was disturbed only by the wind, tracing delicate patterns like the last handwriting of the mountain. The fuselage lay on its side, ribs open to the sky, wires dangling like torn veins. There was no fire, no smoke, no violence left, just a quiet aftermath of something that had once moved fast and believed it would arrive safely. He understood that feeling too well. He ran his fingers along the metal, cold as the truth he'd avoided for years. Up close, the plane wasn't just broken. It had been rearranged by impact, forced into a shape it was never meant to take. And he felt a strange envy toward it. The jet had shattered instantly, violently, honestly. He, on the other hand, had broken slowly, quietly, politely, a long-term collapse disguised as resilience. Inside, the cabin was a small universe of endings, seats ripped from their bolts, a window punched inward by gravity, a piece of luggage split open, its contents frozen into an accidental sculpture of someone's final ordinary day, a shirt sleeve, a book with the last page bent, a pair of glasses missing one lens, as if vision itself had been interrupted mid-thought. He didn't see any bodies, only the artifact of lives that had been interrupted without warning, that somehow felt heavier. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and listened. The mountain hummed. The metal creaked. His breath trembled. And in that trembling he felt an echo, something he had buried long ago, something he had refused to name. The jet wasn't showing him death. It was showing him consequences. The kind that come after years of pretending nothing is wrong. The kind that arrive quietly because they were never spoken aloud. A thought crossed him like a shadow sliding over snow. What if this is what happens when a man goes too long without telling the truth about himself? Not the truth about events or opinions, but the truth about how he carries the weight of his own life, how expectations have shaped him into a fortress he never asked to be, how the world praises men for being unshakable, yet never checks if the foundations beneath them are cracking, how strength is demanded long before it is taught. He remembered his father, stern jaw, silent eyes, the way he held disappointment the same way one holds luggage, firmly with purpose and without complaint. No breakdowns, no vulnerability, just a constant performance of invincibility. They never talked about fear in that house. They never talked about sadness. They barely talked about love, except in actions so subtle they often went unnoticed. And now here he was, staring at metal shaped by impact, recognizing the inheritance he had never questioned. Men don't cry. Men don't fall apart. Men don't ask for help. Men endure. But endurance was not the same as living. Endurance was merely survival stretched thin. He felt the sting in his eyes again, the same sting he tried to swallow when he first saw the wreck. He didn't want to cry over strangers. He didn't want to cry over himself. But grief has its own intelligence. It waits, then chooses its moment. The jet had forced him into honesty. Mountains have a way of stripping men down to whatever truth remains after the world's noise falls away. He took a deep breath, and something inside finally loosened, like a knot tied years ago in the dark, now coming undone in the cold light of altitude. He didn't know what this moment meant. He just knew it was the first time in a very long time that he had allowed himself to feel, without negotiating the feeling. The wreckage, frozen and still, had become a mirror, not of who he was, but of who he could no longer pretend to be. He stepped back in the doorway of the jet, boots crunching into the snow as if each movement were a negotiation with gravity. Nothing around him moved except the wind, pulling at his jacket like an impatient hand. He felt as if the mountain itself was asking him why he had come alone, why men always come alone to the places where they break. He thought about the weight he carried on this climb, not the pack on his shoulders, but the quiet heaviness that had been accumulating for years. It had no name, but he knew its texture. A pressure behind the ribs, a hollowness in the throat right before sleep, the subtle ache that appears when a man remembers he is no longer young enough to ignore himself. Webb would call it the iron cage, the way society wraps expectations around men until they forget the shape they once had. Jung might have suggested it was a shadow long avoided, but he didn't need theory to understand it. He felt in his chest like an old bruise someone kept pressing. He had climbed the mountain to outrun that bruise, imagining solitude as a kind of medicine. But solitude can be deceptive. It doesn't cure anything. It only removes distractions long enough for truth to rise to the surface. And now, surrounded by cold and silence, he was trapped with every unfinished conversation he had never dared to begin. He remembered when the weight first settled on him, not as a dramatic moment, but as a slow erosion, a job he stayed in, because men are supposed to be grateful, a relationship where he became a protective wall, not a person, nights spent staring at a ceiling, convinced that admitting exhaustion would make him weak. He had been taught to be dependable, to carry burdens quietly, to perform competence even when he felt anything but. Strength was expected, not questioned. He knelt by the wreckage, feeling the cold seep into his bones. The mountain wasn't simply winter, it was judgment, but the gentle kind, the kind that doesn't accuse but reveals. He thought of Bourdieu and the invisible scripts that shape a man before he even knows he's memorizing them. The habitus, those ingrained dispositions that whisper how he should stand, speak, endure. His whole life had been a choreography of silent expectations. Never be too emotional. Never show doubt. Never let anyone see the cracks. A man should be the last to break, even when he is the first to feel the fracture. And yet, here he was breaking not because he was weak, but because he was alone enough to finally stop pretending. The wreckage before him became a metaphor, so clear it almost felt staged. A machine built for speed and altitude, designed to cut through clouds, now grounded forever by one impact. He wondered how many men shared that same fate, soaring on the surface, collapsing in private, forced into stillness only by something catastrophic. He touched the torn seatbelt inside the cabin, imagining the last second it was used. The human instinct to hold on, to brace against collision, even when the collision is inevitable. He recognized that instinct in himself. For years he had been bracing against something he couldn't name, tightening around an impact he refused to acknowledge. You can only hold tension for so long before your hands start to shake. The shaking began now, not visibly, but internally, the tremor of a realization that alters the air around it, that the weight he carried wasn't his alone. It belonged to generations of men taught to swallow their own sorrow before it turned into language. It belonged to friends who said they were fine until they weren't. It belonged to fathers who spent their entire lives building emotional fortresses they hoped their sons would never enter. He had come here for clarity. What he found instead was recognition. The jet wasn't a mystery to be solved, but a story written in a language he understood too well. Men don't crash because they're fragile. They crash because they're never allowed to land. He sat in the snow, exhaling a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for years. The weight inside him shifted, not disappearing, but unfolding, rewriting itself into something he could finally look at without flinching. In the cold, he felt something close to relief, not because he found answers, but because he had finally stopped running. He stayed seated in the snow longer than he intended, feeling the cold move through him in slow currents. It didn't numb him. It clarified something, as if the mountain wanted him to finally hear the silence he'd carried for years. Not the ordinary kind, the deep silence, the one men collect inside themselves until it becomes part of their posture. A silence full of swallowed words and unfinished confessions. He didn't realize how loud his life had been. Deadlines, expectations, conversations that sounded like dialogue but never revealed anything real. The background hum of always performing competence. It had been so noisy that he had forgotten what his own thoughts sounded like without an audience. Up here, surrounded by stone and sky, that noise evaporated. What remained was a raw interior terrain he had spent most of his adulthood avoiding. The jet wreckage beside him looked almost peaceful now, a strange monument sculpted by catastrophe. He traced its edges with his eyes, noticing the way sunlight caught on the broken metal. There was a cruel truth in that, how even destruction can shine if the light hits it right. Maybe that was why the scene moved him so deeply, because he sensed his own brightness slipping through the fractures. Durkheim once wrote that society shapes the individual long before he has a chance to shape himself. Sitting there, he felt the weight of that idea with startling clarity. So much of who he thought he was had been assembled from instructions he never questioned. Work hard. Don't falter. Keep quiet. Carry on. Men are raised to be structures, not stories. And structures, when they weaken, collapse inward, quietly without witnesses. He remembered the first time someone told him to man up. He had been 12, on the edge of tears after scraping his knee in front of classmates. A teacher had said it lightly, almost kindly, as if offering him a shortcut to dignity. But dignity built on suppression is a counterfeit kind. It doesn't protect. It corrodes. That moment had been the first brick in the wall he spent decades maintaining. Now, here he was, watching a destroyed machine reflect the state of his unspoken interior life. Something in him rebelled against the parallel. Yet something deeper recognized it instantly. Collapse isn't a single moment. It's the accumulation of moments when a man decides to stay silent. He stood again, legs stiff but grounding him in the snow. The air tasted metallic, sharp. He took in the view, the endless expanse of white, the jagged ridge lines, the sky stretching so wide it made him feel both insignificant and strangely relieved. Insignificance can be liberating. It frees a man from the illusion that he must always be the pillar holding his world together. As he walked slowly around Plain, he noticed something that stopped him. A child's drawing, half crumpled, caught between two twisted panels of aluminum. A simple sketch of a house, a sun, two figures holding hands. The lines were uneven, as if drawn during turbulence. He reached out, brushing off the frost, and something inside him cracked, not painfully, but honestly. It wasn't the tragedy of the drawing itself. It was what it represented. Lives in motion, lives interrupted, lives that meant something to someone. He realized, with a surge of clarity, that he had been living as though his own life were merely an obligation he was fulfilling for others. A contract signed without enthusiasm, maintained without question. Purpose, he thought, had become performance he delivered rather than a truth he inhabited. Ballman would probably say men today are suspended in liquid identities, shifting, adapting, never allowed to solidify. He felt that fluidity now, but in a new way, not as destabilization, but as a possibility of becoming something unscripted, something unperformed, something real. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that meaning is fragile, portable, and always worth protecting, even in ruins. When he looked at the wreck again, he no longer saw catastrophe. He saw a threshold, a place where endings and beginnings blurred, inviting him to finally step across. He didn't rush his next steps. Something inside him understood that haste would betray the moment. There are times in a man's life when the world stops performing for him, and he is finally forced to see its bare structure. This was one of those rare, unguarded pauses, the kind that reveals not just where he is, but what he has been carrying. He made his way toward the tail section of the jet, its metal skin torn open like a wound. Snow had gathered inside, collecting in soft drifts against the seats. He traced the aisles slowly, as if walking to the memory of strangers. There were scattered objects, bags ruptured by impact, a cracked pair of glasses, a dented water bottle. Nothing extraordinary, yet each item felt like a silent witness to the moment everything changed. He felt the weight of Bourdieu's idea of habitus pressing on him, the invisible set of dispositions a man inherits without realizing it. The postures, the expectations, the reflexes of self-control. Up here, among ruins, those inherited reflexes felt absurdly fragile. He could almost sense how many of his decisions had not been his own, but echoes of a world that rewarded men for stoicism and punished them for reflection. He crouched beside one of the seats, brushing snow from the fabric. His gloves left dark streaks across the faded upholstery. He thought of the last moments of the passengers, strangers bound together by a fate they never agreed to. He wondered if any of them had been carrying secrets, quiet burdens like the ones he spent years storing beneath his ribcage. It was a strange comfort, the idea that even in their final seconds, they might have been more like him than he imagined. Jung wrote about the shadow, the side of the self a man avoids until it becomes too heavy to ignore. Here, in the cold cavity of the airplane, he felt his own shadow settle beside him. Not menacing, not dark, just honest. It whispered the truths he had been avoiding, that he had built a life around competence rather than connection, that he had mistaken resilience for muteness, that he had allowed fear disguise itself as responsibility. He breathed in deeply, feeling the cold scrape through his lungs. This was the first time in years he felt something like sincerity inside his body. Not joy, not relief. Something quieter, like a door unlocking. He moved toward the cockpit, the narrow passageway bending inward from the force of impact. The space was cramped, claustrophobic, but he forced himself inside. Wires hung like frozen vines. The instrument panels were shattered. And yet, the strangest sensation washed over him. He felt as if he were staring at the inside of his own life. A cockpit designed to control direction, now utterly directionless. He touched the cracked throttle with gloved fingers. Control, he realized, had always been his illusion. He spent years piloting a life built on expectation, work, obligations, reputation, believing that mastery equaled meaning. But here, surrounded by broken machinery, he felt the truth settle in his bones. Men often mistake responsibility for purpose, and in doing so, lose the thread of themselves. Marx would say that alienation comes from the distance between what a man does and who he is. Inside the cockpit, illuminated by fractured light, he felt the sharp outline of that distance. He had spent so much energy becoming functional that he had forgotten how to feel alive. He backed out, breath trembling. The mountain wind nudged at him as if urging him to keep moving. Outside, the world was painfully silent again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. He stood by the wreck, watching the sky shift above the ridgeline. For a moment, he imagined what the passengers must have seen before the crash. Clouds parting, altitude dropping, a brief instant when control slips beyond reach. That moment of helplessness terrified him, because he recognized it. He had been living in that descent without admitting it. He looked down at the child's drawing he had tucked into his pocket. It felt warm from his body heat, a fragile reminder that every man carries something worth protecting, even if he doesn't know it, even if he has forgotten it, even if the world is convinced him to bury it under competence and silence. He closed his eyes and finally allowed the thought he'd been resisting. He had not come to this mountain to find anything. He had come here because something inside him needed to break open. He didn't realize how far he had walked until he stopped and noticed the wreckage had become a distant shape behind him. Small, almost delicate against the sweep of white. Distance didn't erase the weight of what he'd seen. It sharpened it. The farther he moved from the plane, the closer he felt to himself, as if each step peeled away one of the layers he'd spent years constructing. He found a rocky outcrop half buried in snow and lowered himself onto it. The stone was cold, but grounding. A ridge of wind carried thin curls of ice past his boots, like threads of thought escaping before he could grasp them. He closed his eyes and let the mountain speak in its strange, wordless language. Up here, nothing asked him to perform. Nothing needed him to be capable or steady. The mountain didn't care about his job title or his income, or whether he had his life together. It cared only for presence. Weber once wrote that modern men live inside an iron cage. Systems, rules, expectations so tightly woven they become invisible bars. He had always dismissed that idea as abstract, too theoretical, but now, with frozen air filling his lungs, he sensed the truth of it. His cage had never been made of obligations. It had been made of roles he felt compelled to inhabit. Provider, problem solver, steady hand, quiet backbone, roles that left no room for trembling. He had never told anyone how exhausted he was, that he woke up most mornings feeling like a man rehearsing a life he no longer recognized, that accomplishments, once bright and promising, now felt like receipts of a bargain he never intended to make, that even in rooms full of people, he often felt like a ghost brushing against conversations he couldn't fully enter. On the mountain, these confessions rose easily. There was no one there to reassure, no one to protect from the truth. Loneliness, he realized, wasn't simply the absence of people. It was the absence of a place where he could speak without armor, where he could admit that success had not saved him from emptiness, and resilience had not saved him from isolation. His thoughts drifted back to the drawing in his pocket. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with unsteady hands. The childish scrawl of two figures holding hands felt unbearably tender, not because of the tragedy implied, but because of what exposed in him, a longing he had buried beneath years of competence, a desire to be held, not for strength, but for truth. Durkheim might call it anatomy. The quiet collapse of meaning that happens when the world's expectations no longer align with a man's sense of self. He felt that collapse now, but not as despair, more like recognition. The mountain was stripping him down to something raw and unfiltered, and instead of breaking him, it was clarifying him. He remembered arguments he never voiced, moments of joy he downplayed, invitations to vulnerability he sidestepped out of habit. He remembered nights staring at the ceiling, feeling everything and saying nothing. He remembered the ache of wanting someone to see him, not the version he curated, but the man beneath it. The truth settled in him like snow on stone. He had been lonely for so long, he had forgotten what connection felt like. He let the wind sting his face, welcoming the sensation. It reminded him he was still alive, still capable of feeling something real. He wasn't sure what he wanted from the rest of his life, but he knew he didn't want to keep living inside a structure that consumed him piece by piece. He looked back toward the wreckage, now a faint mark against the vast mountain, and understood something quietly profound. The crash had not just shattered metal. It had cracked open the shell of his own silence. He rose again, steadying himself. This time, when he walked, he carried the drawing in his hand, instead of hiding it. The mountain didn't need him to be unbreakable. It only needed him to be honest. And honesty, he realized, was the one thing he'd been starving for. Morning arrived like a breath caught in the world's throat. Mist curled between the old buildings of serpentine stone, rising slowly as if each street were lighting its memories with cautious hands, afraid of waking whatever preferred to stay asleep. The city never truly rested. It only blinked. And when it blinked, it saw far too much. Kai walked with steps that tried to appear steady, though his heart tumbled inside his chest like a coin spun by an impatient fate. Some would call anxiety. He preferred to believe it was the wind tugging his soul toward the unknown, a mischievous child running ahead without looking back. Beside him, Lyra drifted with that sly calm she carried everywhere, watching the shadows that seemed to shift a fraction more than they should. Shadows held a quiet jealousy of light in that city. They made sure everyone knew it. At each corner, murmurs from underground machinery vibrated through the cobblestones. Ancient gears residents pretended not to hear. Maybe superstition, maybe survival instinct. Hard to tell. But everyone knew something down there breathed. Something vast, with a memory far too long, and an appetite for other people's stories. Kai tried to speak of trivial things, the weather, breakfast, the strange way rain made the streets look like borrowed rivers. But the words never fully came. The air around serpentine stone felt thick that morning, as if language itself hesitated to cross it. Lyra noticed the silence and gave him a crooked, almost tender smile. "You feel it already, don't you?" she asked, as if commenting on the temperature. "Feel what?" "The city. It looked at you today." The sentence landed inside him like someone had flicked on a lantern behind his ribs. He pretended not to understand, gazing at the mist, the buildings, anything that wasn't Lyra's knowing eyes. But serpentine stone loved to insist. A street lamp flickered. A door groaned. A black cat crossed the street with the poise of a creature carrying forbidden knowledge. In the center of the square, a stone statue, a warrior carved with a furious expression, seemed to have shifted positions during the night. Not unusual there. Or perhaps it was only unusual to admit. The city chewed on its secrets the way old trees chew on light. They reached the old observatory, a crooked building too stubborn to collapse, defying gravity and good sense with the obstinacy of an elder refusing retirement. The windows were fogged over, like eyes waking from a heavy dream. Lyra pushed the door. It moaned. Dust rose. The atmosphere thickened instantly, as though they crossed into the belly of something that slept lightly. Kai felt the air change, tangible, warm, alive. "There's something new today," Lyra murmured, tilting her face toward the stairs spiraling upward. Something opened. Kai inhaled slowly. The air smelled of aged wood, rusted metal, and light. A light that wasn't from lamps. A light that felt like it had a heartbeat. Something called to them from above, newly awakened, expectant. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, each step sounding like a small complaint. At the top, they found the main chamber glowing with a sphere suspended in the air. Not fire, not glass, not any familiar magic. It looked like nostalgia condensed into luminous form, intimate, breathing, impossibly alive. Something inside Kai stirred. Lyra felt it too, as if the entire city had projected its beating heart into that room, asking to be understood. And in that moment of trembling breath and impossible radiance, Kai recognized an irritating yet comforting truth. The city didn't just see them, it chose them. Their story was only beginning, and Serpentine Stone, with all its invisible eyes, seemed thoroughly pleased with how things were unfolding. Stories like this always leave a shimmering path forward, a ribbon of possibilities stretching into whatever comes next. The climb back down felt different, as if the mountain had exhaled and let him go. Snow softened beneath his boots, no longer the harsh mirror that had reflected his fears, but a quiet companion. He carried no souvenirs except the drawing, folded carefully, pulsing against his chest like a small, stubborn heartbeat, one that wasn't his, yet somehow belonged to him now. The tree line greeted him with that patient hush forests always wear when they're listening. Sunlight bled to the branches in slow gold ribbons, warming his face, making the world feel both larger and gentler. He didn't rush. He let each step land with intention. Small vows written into the earth, Promises he wasn't ready to speak aloud but was ready to live. Hours later, the silhouette of the town appeared, huddled at the base of the valley like a cluster of memories that refused to be forgotten. The rooftops glowed faintly in the late afternoon, chimneys breathing thin curls of smoke. Smoke meant life, warmth, people, things he had long convinced himself he didn't need. He reached the first house, and the familiar weight of the world pressed briefly against his shoulders, but it didn't settle. Not like before. The armor he had always worn didn't latch itself on again. It hung somewhere behind him, rusting quietly in the snow. At the ranger's cabin, he knocked. When the door opened, light spilled onto him, bright and almost too human. Faces looked at him with questions. Was he hurt? Did he find anything? Was the storm worse up there? But he answered only the ones that mattered. "There's a wreck," he said softly. His voice didn't tremble. "A private jet. No survivors." The rangers exchanged a kind of solemn glance shared by people who understand the mountains and their appetite. They asked for details, coordinates. His words were steady, not cold, simply clear. The truth didn't cut him anymore. It only shaped him. One of the rangers noticed the paper in his hand. "What's that?" He hesitated, then unfolded it. The drawing seemed even more fragile in the warm room, like it belonged to a world too tender for survival. "A reminder," he whispered, "of something I don't want to forget again." They didn't ask further. Some things are respected in silence. Later, after the paperwork and the radio calls and the murmured condolences, he stepped back outside. The sky was shifting toward evening, painted in long strokes of violet and ember. He walked to the edge of the town, where the land opened like a breath finally released. The mountain loomed in the distance, ancient, indifferent, and yet somehow intimate. He held the drawing one last time. Two simple figures. One small hand and a bigger one. Love distilled into the simplest shape a human heart can manage. He didn't cry. The tears had already done their work on the mountain. Instead, he whispered, not a prayer, not a farewell, but a promise only the wind needed to hear. "I won't go back to sleep." The world didn't answer. It didn't need to. His life had already begun shifting, realigning like snow melting into a river's new course. He felt it in his spine, in his breath, in the steady pulse beneath his palm. The loneliness that once gnawed at him had softened into something else. Not company, not clarity, but honesty. The rarest kind of warmth, the type that grows from the inside out. He turned back toward the town, ready to re-enter a life that would feel unfamiliar only because he was finally inhabiting it fully. Behind him, the mountain held its silence. Ahead of him, the world waited, patient, unthreatening, real, and he walked toward it without armor, without fear, without pretending.